So I just finished the movie Jerry Maguire, and I thought it was a little bit hokey, but there was a part in the movie where at the very beginning, Jerry Maguire, if you haven't seen it, he's a sports agent, and he has a revelation early on in the movie that he doesn't really like or respect himself. He's not really pursuing an end that he finds meaningful. And that definitely struck a chord with me. That's pretty much where I was when I resigned a year ago, my job. And I think it's where a lot of us are right now. And I don't, I think a lot of us sort of tamp that down or we're maybe unable to articulate it. But I was recently watching a video that was sort of dissecting the movie Fight Club. I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, but it's a pretty interesting movie. And there's a line or a series of lines in the movie that it went over in the video. And I just thought, wow, that's deep and entirely relevant to right now, a lot of our experience. I've talked about it a couple times. So the lines of the movie were advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. No great war. No great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. And that was pretty poetic, I thought. Um, I don't know how often you think about materialism and how for the last 75 years our culture has been basically built around that and consumption. But I think that we've reached the point where you hear it in the news, you hear calls for institutional change, right? Or institutional reform. And right now, the big institution that everybody has in their minds is the police department. And for good reason. There are many things wrong with the police department. I don't mean to say that the police are wholly at fault for society's problems, and they do a lot of good things. And I think that police are overworked in certain capacities. I have talked in previous episodes about how there's been this mission creep where they've been expected to deal with things that really aren't under their jurisdiction typically, like mental illness. When our mental institutions closed back in the 80s with the act Lanterman Petrus Short, it basically put police officers in the sole responsibility of being caretakers effectively for the mentally ill that were now on the streets. So these institutional reforms that need to take place are nuanced, but they're not solely, for sure, just related to the police department. I think that we're moving into an era which I've talked about several times in previous podcasts, where it's the culmination of all these things that we realize are wrong and haven't been able to articulate or haven't been able to speak out about for fear that we will have our reputation permanently damaged or that we will lose our source of income for speaking out. There aren't generally very good whistleblower protections if you exist within these institutions. But one thing that we don't talk about with institutions is over time, even the institutions that are created in generally most institutions in our society are created with a higher ideal in mind. But over time, these institutions basically become corrupted in a sense that their primary purpose becomes perpetuating themselves and justifying themselves, and the people within those institutions justifying their continued purpose. So, if the original intent is to, let's say, educate the public or to fix some injustice, over time that takes a backseat or is more ignored, and it's more about maintaining the jobs or maintaining the reputation of the people within that institution. And I've talked about institutional decay a lot. I've talked about the Catholic Church. I've talked about the media, corporations, government is an obvious one, the welfare state, the regulatory state, the social security apparatus, the military industrial complex, big pharma, academia, Hollywood. What else am I missing other than police? Any institution that exists has a major scandal that you look at and you said, how has this been able to go on as long as it did, with people just basically turning a blind eye to it, knowing that it's there, but saying nothing about it? One example in Hollywood, the casting couch. Another example in academia, the fact that it's basically a diploma mill, and that the cost of education has gone up precipitously and the value of what is being provided has gone down. The fact that educating students in fostering critical thought is far, far behind basically building on faculties and using the professors for research rather than for teaching. So yeah, there's a lot that we can simultaneously get done with all these institutions. The three institutions that I think that I tend to focus on more are the media, education, and the military industrial complex. These are three that I occasionally hear criticisms about, but it's always sort of a one-sided discussion. There's starting to be a growing sense from both the left and the right, however you define those, right? That there is something wrong with the police and that reform is necessary. But the media, the very nature of media, we need to ask deep, important questions about what its role is in a society that now has access to effectively infinite information, now that the internet has fully fleshed out. Well, our society is still dealing with the earth-shattering, groundbreaking impact of the internet, and having information, having the capacity to research anything and discredit any idea that somebody puts forward. We don't really know, or generally lots of people don't really think about why they think a certain way or how the human mind works, but we're narrative-based creatures, and we perceive reality through narrative, building these stories where we are basically the central character or the hero often in our own stories, right? Now, the problem with that, first of all, is that it forces us to see ourselves as a moral force of good, when in reality each of us is infinitely capable of villainy in our small everyday interactions, and that can add up over time. It's like the small lies told often become the big lies, and that's how, for example, the Soviet Union was allowed to or was able to survive as long as it did. The way that the disservice that we do in our everyday deceptions accumulate over time. And the same thing for our everyday cruelties, our little actions, how we treat each other with malice, and how we say that we are justified. That's the story in our brain that says that basically gives ourselves and the people that we know closely the benefit of the doubt, but says that the people that maybe we don't like or we don't know as well have sinister motives. There's something, I'm a big student of history, particularly the 20th century, and mass movements, Nazism, communism. I'm sure you know this by now, but I always am fascinated by how people think that they would historically, in a given context, have been the good guys. they would have helped the Jews in Nazi Germany. They would have helped the slaves if they were, alive back during the mid 19th century. And statistically speaking, this is something that Jordan Peterson has talked about. You wouldn't have been that person. It takes an exceptional person, and I think that this plays heavily into this moral superiority that people present today. And it's a huge problem because I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the term trial by ordeal, but back during the Salem witch trials, for example, or any number of instances of historical mass hysteria where mobs of people just kind of go nuts and try to prove their moral purity and have others prove their moral purity. There was something called the trial by ordeal, where when in Salem, Massachusetts, when they said, "We think you're a witch," they would hold somebody underwater with the idea that if they were a witch, that they would save themselves or they wouldn't drown. And of course, because nobody was a witch, they all drowned. And then they said, "Oh, well, I guess they weren't a witch." So there's no real way to win that battle, right? If you're being accused of witchcraft, you're basically just, it's a losing battle. You have to prove a negative, and the onus is on you to prove the accusation, which you cannot disprove. And we are in that situation right now with bigotry, because bigotry exists, and when it becomes embedded in larger institutions, it can become a major societal problem. But some amount of bigotry will always be there. And the thing that we have to realize is that we are all capable of bigotry, and none of us is pure. In this pursuit of purity today has us mimicking a mass hysteria of the past, where you can accuse somebody of something like bigotry, and it becomes impossible for them to prove the negative, that they are not a bigot. And therefore, it is equivalent to the trials by ordeals in the mass hysteria of previous eras, the Salem witch trials, for example. And we're in that right now. And I think that a lot of people make the mistake of going, "Oh, those religious kooks, we're not like that. We're not religious." And it's like, religion isn't necessarily defined by your belief in a deity. It's defined by how firmly you believe a dogmatic creed. And depending on who you ask, they're going to have different definitions of what religion is, whether they're more favorable towards it or more cynical about it. But a lot of what defines religion is how dogmatically you pursue purity. And just like there's a difference between the religious principles of any religion, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and the institutions that form around that, just like there's a difference between the founding principles of the American Constitution and the actual country and government that has existed for the last 200 plus years, we need to realize that purity in the real world is not, there is no purity. You can pursue it as an ideal, and that's a noble ideal, but the fact that we're piling on each other and trying to annihilate each other, and we no longer have this sense that if you sin or if you fall short of the ideal, that you are irredeemable, that you cannot come back from that, and that we will not do you the honor of extending to you forgiveness. I think that only serves to drive a wedge in between everybody and to force everybody to live in a constant state of fear and suspicion of each other. And when you keep people in this constant state of tension, where they basically they're confused because of the explosion of information from the internet, and they are fearful and suspicious because they don't know when other people, even friends, like young people in particular now, I think they constantly are sort of looking around, not really knowing who's their ally, because if they misspeak or say the wrong thing, then they're going to get thrown to the wolves of social justice, or if you're from the more right side, maybe you'll get if you say, I don't really like President Trump or his policies or something like that, maybe they'll throw you to the wolves too. So like each side is going through these purity tests where they're purging their ranks for more purity. And this is exactly what existed in the Soviet Union. These are the Stalinist purges of our day, where in endless pursuit of purity, you throw everybody into the dustbin. And we've reached this tipping point where there are more people in the trash bin that have been considered irredeemable than there are people who are pure, because the purity is a lie. It is a fiction. It is not an achievable actual end. It is just a goal, an ideal goal. I think that the people are starting to basically wake up. The people in the middle who are just trying to lead good lives and not be cruel or terrible to each other are realizing that small minorities on either end of the political divide are the ones who are loudest and get a disproportionate amount of power. And when we pull back the curtain, like in The Wizard of Oz, we see that it's actually a small number of not very powerful people who have been cajoling us and who have been intimidating us. And we have allowed this to happen. And it's frustrating because all these little acts of cowardice and basically loss of courage have added up to the situation that we're in now. And I think that a lot of the frustration in the, okay, that's it, I'm done with this, I don't want to participate in this. Everybody is fearful and walking on eggshells and anxious that they're going to just be torn up in front of the mob in the Colosseum, and our modern Colosseum, which is social media and public shaming. The counter response to that largely fed Donald Trump's rise. And I think that there's been a lack of introspection, unfortunately, over the last 4 years as to what deeper factors have led to the perpetuation of Donald Trump's appeal. Along came this guy who was totally unapologetic and would do and say whatever was opportune at any given moment. And it's not clear that there are higher principles. It's frustrating because if you look into this, if you have an intellectual curiosity, you can find conversations and valuable approaches to answers. It's not just a single answer. It's a mesh. It's a network of different answers. I've talked about this in other podcasts. Knowledge, we need to completely revolutionize what we think of as knowledge. Knowledge isn't something that is finite. It's not something that previously it was information contained between two covers in a book on a shelf somewhere, and they were gatekeepers to knowledge. They were intellectuals that would, now knowledge isn't, the intellectuals were curators. Now knowledge is whatever anybody can add to it. So, the internet has allowed people to infinitely network little pieces of information, and they're hyperlinked, right? So knowledge is now a nebulous cloud that's infinitely growing and infinitely interconnected. And when I started talking earlier about how we're narrative creatures, it used to be that when I first started talking about the media, I know I go off on these tangents. So I was saying the media is one of these institutions that needs to change, and we're narrative creatures. And it used to be media consumption. People were told back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, that journalists and the media would give you the important information, which was the news, right? And our parents' generation and their parents' generation had people like Walter Cronkite back when there were three. You got to remember, TV was an entirely new invention in the 60s, right? And 50s and 60s. And there were not very many options for newspapers. And so the limited number of options meant that information was relatively tightly controlled, not to mention that we were in a global struggle against another massive national power, which meant that the information tended to be more propaganda and rah rah America, we're good, Soviet Union bad. And not saying that a lot of the Soviet Union and what they advocated wasn't bad, but the information was heavily biased to push that narrative and that view. And so people grew up believing that a steady diet of media information made them a good, responsible, informed citizen. And that that might have largely been the best that they could have done at the time, but it was nonetheless propaganda. Unless you were sampling information from a ton of different sources in drawing your conclusions by amalgamating all those things together, then you were getting a biased account of the world. You were basically being told what strong institutions wanted you to be told. And I've talked about this in a previous episode too, but there's a documentary series called The Century of Self, which goes into how Edward Bernays basically created who was the nephew of Freud, created the idea of public relations. And he had every institution, whether it be a government entity or a private entity, like somebody tied to a corporation, these public relations specialists would basically create propaganda messages, and they would feed those to journalists, and then the journalists would wrap narrative around that and spin it, and that would become news. So what news is in a traditional sense is pieces of propaganda that are pre-selected and pre-digested into narrative for you to consume, for the average citizen to consume easily without seeking their own information. But increasingly, the age of information that we're in, the social media and an internet age, has obliterated that and also interacted with it in a weird way. Where, for example, the so our media ever since the 90s, mid 90s, when it started to become 24/7 television news media, and you had MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, they realized that the model that they could rely on was infotainment. It sort of started with the O.J. Simpson car chase, and when the NBA Finals was put on hold, and they were showing the Bronco racing down the freeway, and the media companies realized, hey, people seem to like these things. They like car chases and shootouts and violence. And so the media became increasingly more of the, the murders, the rapes, the thefts, the gory or salacious things that people liked to see. I mean, think about how popular true crime is as a topic in podcasts and movies and documentaries, things like that. You get a taste for what people, what titillates them, right? So that's the news really caught on to that, and they had to start to appease the advertisers more so that they could get more eyeball time, more people watching, so that they could try to sell them more stuff. And the more news plays off of people's fears and worries, and advertisements play off of people's self-perceptions and insecurities. So you have this business that plays off of all of that, and unfortunately, there's this legacy of people assuming they have to continue to consume news to be responsible and to be engaged citizens, and that forces them to be anxious, continue to sort of exist in this anxious cycle of consuming information that depresses them and makes them feel more insecure, and peddles a product at them as a solution to their problems and their insecurities. So media today takes advantage of people's angers and fears, and so do demagogues, right? So does our current president, and it's it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that the media is set up in a way that right now it works perfectly, perfectly in sync with what Donald Trump, uh, basically what his best skill set is. He is a master persuader, as Scott Adams has said. Whether you like him or not, you got to give the devil his due, right? So he is extremely skilled at the art of persuasion in sales tactics, and he is extremely good at direct communication and simple repeated message, which is propaganda, right? So you can say big wall, big wall, big wall. It starts to stick over time. It's visual. People hold on to those. The nicknames that he gives people, low energy jab, right? So he's really good at direct communication with his audience through social media, through Twitter, and through the rallies that he holds, right? And unfortunately, so there's no middlemen there. And unfortunately, these feed his narcissism too. So it's his narcissistic supply. We've talked about narcissism on the podcast before too, but learn about narcissism more. It's I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit, but so the media today, it picks up on things that really aren't news. It basically will, you have so much media fragmentation, which in a way is a good thing because it has all these different perspectives, right? But what happens is this weird sort of incestuous relationship between different media groups and social media, where some famous person or some troll will say something and on some social media platform, and then that in itself will become a story. Just something that somebody said, whether it's like, LeBron James or Taylor Swift or somebody more political, whatever. Something that somebody says becomes a news story, and I don't know, maybe BuzzFeed or somebody will write some kind of pop journalist news entity will write an article about some tweet, and then another entity will write an article about that article, and then another third entity will write an article about an article about an article, and it becomes further and further from the original source. And also the original source was generally just an opinion or something like that, right? And then eventually the large organizations, corporate media, will pick up on it, whether it's CNN or Fox or MSNBC, and then they'll have a story about somebody's explanation or assessment of somebody else's assessment of somebody else's assessment of a tweet, and then they'll have live speculation on the air of that assessment of an assessment of an assessment of a tweet. And it's kind of like societal retardation in a way. And it really is starting to bring down, and has brought down, the general engagement, intelligent engagement of society. The conversations are low level and revolve around the same repeated thoughts over and over again, and there's not really a boring in, because anything that's worth saying that could be interesting or engaging has the capacity to offend, and nobody is willing to offend. So therefore, nobody, or what I should say is, a huge chunk of people is unwilling to offend, and the other side is pushing against that, and they're eager to offend. And both are kind of uh, not very helpful. It should just be like saying what needs to be said and risking offending, right? Because you're never going to say anything worthwhile, and you're never going to solve any problem at any deeper level if we are not willing to risk offending. Um, and it's unfortunate that a lot of people are stuck and they don't really know how to put themselves in a position where they can have an honest opinion, or an opinion of their own. A lot of people are just sort of fed information that is not really their opinion. They are just taking a narrative chunk and making it their own, putting it into their head, and robotically spouting that information. And I'm not saying that humans are all of a sudden going to become non-narrative creatures, but you have to have this metacognition of understanding how the human mind works, and then you will start to see the pitfalls of when your mind or other people's minds are doing certain things, like confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance and these psychological errors, when they're useful, when they're roadblocks. So instead of trying to avoid narrative altogether, which would make you inhuman, because humans aren't capable, we have this wetware, incredibly sophisticated computer in our heads. Granted, we all vary on the spectrum of how intelligent we are, but our brain, our organic computer in our head, is not capable, like a computer or a smartphone, of processing raw information, data essentially. And you think about these sensors in our heads and in our bodies, our senses, right? And what they do is they bring in data, and our brain produces the story, whether it's a religious narrative or a national narrative, or another type of narrative, a narrative about our group identities, our race, our gender, our sexuality, right? These are all, at the end of the day, narratives. And there can be truth to these, elements of truth to the narratives, but when you just basically grab a whole narrative, like if it's a religious one, for example, if you just say, okay, Christianity is the ultimate truth, or a national narrative, Americanism is the ultimate truth, or anything like that, then you're being intellectually lazy. And what you ought to be doing is sampling information from all different sources and basically reconciling it into a more complex narrative of your creation, and then be willing and open to have a conversation with somebody else and hear their narrative, and then reconcile those two narratives and come up with a more sophisticated narrative, and then talk with another person, and then it gets increasingly more sophisticated. And the way I've explained it in the past is, if you just have a narrative like Christianity is the ultimate truth, or Islam, or Nazism, or communism, or Americanism, or whatever, then your narrative is like a plate glass window where if you throw a rock at it, it will shatter. That's why people with single narrative life ideologies or worldviews are extremely anxious of having those challenged, because they realize that they don't have the answers to push back against when they're criticized. So they get angry and violent and try to suppress people who challenge. But if you are open to having your views challenged and open to seeing ridicule of various views, then you create a much stronger structure, a much stronger worldview, much more sophisticated one that's more like a stained glass window than a piece of plate glass. And then if somebody throws a rock at it, then only a little tiny piece of the what's the word I'm looking for? Not like a collage, but like a mosaic. A little tiny piece of the glass might break out, but the whole thing doesn't shatter. And you're much more confident and comfortable with letting people throw rocks at it because, hey, ultimately, your view can only get better, right? It's not going, your entire life and everything you know isn't going to fall apart if somebody discredits. So you should be, the attitude should be being open to being discredited rather than being resentful and intensely frustrated. You should want to have somebody poke holes in what you believe, and then you can only make what you believe even better and more sophisticated and easier said than done. But you know, the media, like what I've just talked about, with being so open to anything that could constitute information or news, is perfectly fit for Donald Trump's brand of communication, where he'll say a tweet and then all the news sources will give their opinions and their rage and their resentment and everything, and then the main news outlets are forced to basically use his content, and he can manipulate them that way because they'll endlessly talk about it. They will always go for the bait, and there will always be content there that people will tune in for. And I think that the media realizes that Donald Trump they have this bittersweet relationship with him where, like, obviously most of them, when they talk about him, they talk about how much they hate him and how bad he is. And I think they in the back of their head realize that he is the media, and that without him they would have no content, and that they were slipping to begin with. And Donald Trump saved them, and he saved Twitter to a large extent, people's interest in it. And when he goes away, when he's no longer president, they will begin their descent again. It's the reality. I wonder if there's a sense when the media reports on coal miners and people whose professions are increasingly less relevant, or increasingly changing due to technology and automation or whatever different sources of energy. But when they report on somebody like coal miners, and they talk about sort of, oh, well, you know, it's just the changing nature of the world where we're going to need more cleaner, sustainable sources of energy, and coal mining is just not in the future. So, you know, the coal miners are gonna have to find something else. I wonder if in the back of their heads, the journalists are realizing that journalism, as it's been practiced, is also going the way of the dodo, and that they themselves will have to find other sources of employment, or leverage their skills in other ways, or learn how the new media works. And when I say the new media, people are increasingly engaging in long-form conversations, listening to podcasts, watching documentaries, having different conversations through different types of social media, and watching YouTube videos, and reading alternative perspectives. And that's what the new media is. That, like, it exists in reality, but not by definition or not by name. And this is sort of what we don't realize, is we live through these things, these transitions, and we don't know what's happening as we're going through it. It's immensely confusing. and then later on somebody gives it a term, right? So when the Civil War was occurring, I'm not thinking that many people were referring to it as the Civil War. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know off the top of my head, but a lot of these things, the terms come later on. So this is the new media, and it's only to the peril of the existing media if they ignore it, because they are sinking and they do not realize it, because Trump has buoyed them up. So that's media. That is why that institution needs to change, because it is a hot mess and it is misleading people, and the people that grew up with it, particularly our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation, still look to it to provide them with uh, instruction or information. And it's an unfortunate tendency that uh, it's like the environment has shifted, and you no longer are going to uh, basically succeed in the same way if you look to the traditional media institutions for your information. You're going to be endlessly confused, and this is one of the issues, is that when you grow up basically not when you grow up with not much variety in looking for particular sources for your information, for your diet of information, then you become effectively dependent on those sources, or you become dependent on somebody providing you the information. But we live in the world now where you're supposed to go out and seek information on your own and be active and be responsible and be able to judge effectively and get very good at being able to filter out the signal from the noise, and being able to separate the wheat from the chaff, to be able to determine through our mental filtering what information is important and what information is not, what is reliable, what is unreliable, what leans towards truth and what leans towards falsehood. All of these things were not practiced over time by the older generations, so they tend to be much weaker at them. And that is a contributing factor as to why the boomer generation in particular spreads a lot of falsehood on social media. Not saying that it's exclusively them, but disproportionately older generations will just say, oh, okay, well, I just read this on the interwebs, right? And this is true because I read it and somebody wrote it and it's true. So I'm going to post it or I'm going to share it. Definitely a lot of millennials and Zs and X do that too, but disproportionate boomer. So a second institution that absolutely needs to be updated is the, let's see, media, military industrial complex. Oh, education. Oh my God. I mentioned this last episode. Education is a total shit show. So, okay, first of all, talk about an institution, starting with higher education. Talk about an institution where the people exist and purely, continuously justify their own existence. It's awful. So first of all, the growth in the cost of college education has been largely due to the increased faculty and staff of these universities, particularly private universities. And if you look at a lot of the things that that the faculty and staff that have been invested in, a lot of it will be sort of, like diversity initiatives and things like that. And you look at some of the titles that people hold, and it's just like the worst corporate mayonnaise you'll ever see. And the corporatization of education is really an American tragedy. And it's also tragic because it's being pitched as it's a product. Education has become a product. It's not about, it was originally sort of an elite institution of, okay, the children of the wealthy would be brought to school and they would be taught refinement and bourgeois norms, and they could take some leisure course of study, and they ideally would learn critical thought capacities, or they would exercise those. But then it leans towards job skills, and it became a job training institution. But increasingly, as the economy becomes more and more uncertain, as technology begins to pervade and change our institutions, change the economy, then the job market is uncertain. So what are you training for, or what are you paying for? You're paying for an uncertain future, and you're paying a tremendous cost for an uncertain future. And students are sold this meme that education, college education, is their ticket to the American dream, much in the same way that home ownership was pushed as the embodiment of the American dream. And then the government encouraged banks to lend to subprime lenders who shouldn't have gotten loans. And then that led to the '08 housing crisis and the financial collapse. It's the same thing again with college education, where we're pumping that bubble up and it's going to explode. You have tons of college debtors who not only paid tons of money and took on debt at an age where we basically say that they shouldn't be deciding if they can have sex. They shouldn't be deciding if they they're not allowed to, wait, when can you vote? 18? They can vote. They can't drink yet. But it's like this point in their life that their brain is still developing in the center of the ages of development, basically, largely still undeveloped, their brains, and we're asking them to sign a a contract to take on a ton of debt. They don't understand the capacity, or they don't understand the extent to which that will impact their lives or what they are signing up for. And there's a whole series of players in this institution of higher education that contributes to that, whether it's the loan officers, the bankers, the guidance counselors, the college admissions, the parents, the everybody is just feeding into this fucking bullshit about, this is your ticket, take it. Maybe at one point it was like, people are really bad with changing circumstances. So when the boomers were young and college age, college education was much more accessible, much more affordable, and it made sense to take it because then you could go on to a better job and support a family. And jobs themselves tended to be much more available, better quality jobs, right? So, at that time, investing in education was truly a wise decision. Today, you cannot take that same lesson from an era where the circumstances were far different and transplant it and say, yes, do it. Of course, some people are still going to get an immense benefit out of education in certain circumstances for certain majors, but to just push education without differentiating between what you're studying, what debt you're taking on, if you'll be able to repay it, what the societal or economic necessity of your chosen field is, it is immensely irresponsible. And that's what we've been engaging in. And now we have this huge bubble, and the institutions are protecting themselves, and they've doubled down and effectively insisted that the college education is essential, and that they've done no wrong. And there are these admissions scandals where you have wealthy parents who are getting their children in when they shouldn't get in. They're tampering with who should get in based on their race or ethnicity. So the Harvard's admission scandals with the Asians, where they're holding down Asians so that they can allow other races and ethnicities to get in. Man, it is a mess, and not to mention the fact that you have college professors chosen primarily for their research and only secondarily for their capacity to teach. And so I was mechanical engineering, and I had some great professors, but some of the professors, like, not only, and this is more just my personal bone to pick, but like they're teaching a very complex subject with difficult numerical language and symbols and things like that. And then there's also generally a heavy accent, and on top of that, oftentimes incapacity to teach, or a rustiness in the ability to teach. Like maybe they haven't taught in a decade or something like that, because they devote the school has invested in their research. So it's like the schools need to just face themselves in the mirror and say, what is our product? Is our product education, or is that just something that we're saying and it's not really? We're basically just a diploma mill where we're giving a devalued piece of paper to students that says they're a thing that they aren't. And first of all, just because you get a diploma or a credential that says you're a thing doesn't mean that you're a good version of that thing. And increasingly, the economy and companies have realized that these institutions of higher education are churning out people who are largely incompetent in their field of study. And the colleges basically push people through so that they can get the numbers that say we have this graduation rate, and then they get additional benefits off of those numbers. So there's an incentive to lie and skew the numbers and grade on the curve and push more people through so that they can get on the Forbes 100 list or whatever other list, or they can get commendations and awards and get more people and get more money. And it's the same thing going on right now to an extent with COVID, where there's an incentive for some hospitals to pump the numbers of their COVID cases and the death counts and the who has the symptoms, because you get a what do you call it, a subsidy or a bailout, or you get a chunk of money basically when you massage the numbers. So you're getting people who graduate into a world where they're increasingly unprepared and increasingly indebted, and you have a lot of people who are complicit in this, a lot of people not saying a damn thing about it, people who would just say, well, I would say something about it, but I have to keep my job or my reputation, or other people are going to turn against me if I speak out about this. And you know what? There's a disparate impact here. It's not equally possible for everybody to be, revolutionary in the conversations that they have, or the person to raise their hand and say, I'm going to be the whistleblower, or I'm going to bring up the immense problems here. Because some people are in a position, they have a family, they have to provide, and they can't risk. So not everybody's equally, capable of bringing up the issues. But at the same time, it's incumbent upon the people who effectively don't have as much to lose to realize that nobody else is going to say anything. If you realize all of the things that are going on and you choose not to say anything, then effectively it is an act of cowardice, and it is one that you might look back on later in your life with regret and say, I could have done something and I didn't. And man, it would be unfortunate to live through that at some point, to live with regret that injustice was being done and nobody said anything about it. So it's really, education is just fucked right now. It it's people deceive themselves who have gotten the degrees to say this has to have incredible value because I paid a high amount for it. So it has to be valuable because otherwise it would be a lie. Yeah, it is. Um, it basically largely is. And it is not only is it largely without value, but it increasingly devalues as it becomes more common. As more, I'm not saying there needs to be an engineered exclusivity to credentials, but there is, it's the normal for people to have bachelor's degrees, for example, or it's becomes much more normal. So there needs to be a new credential or a new factor to assess. And unfortunately, it's just ticked up to the master's degree for a lot of people. So you have a lot of people going back to school, not knowing what they want to do with their lives. So they just seek the comfort and the coziness of continued education. And they don't really know why they're doing it other than the fact that other people do it. And it just seems to be the thing to do. So load on more debt. It's really a racket. And then on top of that, you have professors who tell their students to buy the textbooks that they wrote. I have an example of when I was in an electrical engineering class where the professor told me to, he told all of the students that they had, the book that they had to buy was his textbook. And on the first day of class, he handed out a packet of corrections for all of the typos and all of the problems with how the electrical engineering problems were solved in the book. Basically saying, hey, use this as a supplement to the book and see, match, you can see all of my errors. Great investment of money with that textbook. So, man, this is just the structure of education, never mind the content of education. Now, here's the thing. The internet, as I have mentioned, was incredibly disruptive. The effects of what it would be were not foreseen except for the people who were engaged in what this technology might be and who were paying attention and reading about it and learning about it. But for most people just said, I don't, this thing is just going to be a hobbyist thing. The nerds are going to be able to play some games like Pong on it, and otherwise it's going to be useless. This just snuck up and changed everything. And for most people, it was entirely unanticipated. We're still trying to figure out the depths of how it has changed the world and will continue to change the world. But there are things coming up, three massive things in particular that are going to be far more impactful than the internet, and all happening simultaneously, all happening in parallel. And they're going to be genetics, discoveries in genetic science and genetic enhancement, and CRISPR, if you don't know what that is, gene editing, human modification, cyborg. It sounds ridiculous, but we are millennials. We are the first cyborg generation without realizing it. We have these phones that we are effectively attached to, and our wetware, hardware, software interface, our brain computer interface is incredibly sophisticated, and the older generations tend to look with disdain upon our obsessions with our devices. But if we lose our device, it has literally become a part of our body where we, well, maybe not literally, but it has almost become a part of our body where when we lose it, we feel like we have lost a hand or some actual biological part of our body. Moving forward, it's going to become even more sophisticated, the brain computer interfacing, and particularly with Elon Musk working on Neuralink, which is the brain implant, which is a computer effectively in your brain, and other technological developments. So prosthetics that can be controlled by the brain, things like that. And then the third thing is artificial intelligence. And that is going to have tremendous impact. I've talked about this numerous times, but it's going to completely revolutionize the workforce. It's going to completely revolutionize the economy. It's going to change so many things, and we're going to have to lean on these levers of technology, because some people are going to say, oh, well, we should just ignore it. We should ban AI or something like that and try to move forward with old ideas or traditional ideas. It's like, well, it's if we're going to attempt to solve things like global warming, we're going to have to make our economy more efficient. And to make it more efficient, that means removing humans from as many parts of the economy as possible where humans don't need to be. Because humans tend to make inefficient decisions, and they tend to make judgments that aren't the best. Not to say that AI is going to be perfect off the bat, but it's going to have tremendous impact, and it's the basically we haven't prepared people to education is still preparing people for a job market that is basically stable and as it has been. When this is going, we're at the cusp of that hockey stick curve that you saw in Inconvenient Truth, but for technological innovation. The developments are going to come closer and closer together. There's going to be an accelerating effect, and it's going to be extremely difficult to predict and extremely difficult for most people to process what is happening or what might happen next because of all the things that are happening at once. And so the things that higher education is teaching right now are effectively going to be irrelevant, but a lot of people are going to find that to be so disturbing or to be so inconvenient that they're going to bury their heads in the sand, and it is going to be to their detriment. So the things that effectively we need to teach are collaboration, critical thinking, and adaptability. So I know I said that weird, adaptability. And we need to, I think, have more definitely more online learning, but more engagement in complex conversations and a, an attempt to rehabilitate resilience among the population. Because this concept of a one-size-fits-all education is not going to be effective anymore, because people think differently. We're trying to standardize people's brains. The future is going to be more personalized in a lot of ways, because we're going to have the technology to interface and assess people, their body. You know, we're going to have biosensors and things saying, oh, this person has this reaction to this food, and their body produces glucose at this rate, things like that. So we don't have to have one-size-fits-all diets. We won't have to have one-size-fits-all education, one-size-fits-all medicine, healthcare. Medicine is going to be more personalized. Right now, it's general medicine, right? Where it's, okay, this works for more than 50% of the population, so we'll try it on any given person. So what I have to say, I guess, is that the institution itself of education needs to be changed, and then the content of what is being taught needs to be changed. And one of the biggest things that we need to get our heads around is that the future is going to, if we actually do it properly and integrate technology and artificial intelligence into the way we do things, humans will have more free time. I've talked about this before on a podcast too. All this stuff, I'm bringing a lot of this stuff together. But Bullshit Jobs is a book by David Graeber, where he talks about how we have this cultural aversion to free time, where we think that when people have idle time, then they are going to do terrible things, commit crimes, do things that are detrimental to themselves. And that is a horrible assumption because a lot of creativity comes from free time, a lot of creative endeavor, a lot of uh, thoughtful consideration of new ideas comes from free time. Obviously, bad things can come from free time too, but that varies person to person. But if we allow people to have more free time, then there will be a creative renaissance where people will produce more solutions for all of the problems that we face, as well as wonderful art and content for other people to consume and to share their thoughts on. And then people will also be able to engage at will in work projects through the gig economy, through freelancing, and I think that as education shifts, it's going to become more skill-based again rather than credential-based, and that COVID has been a catalyst. It has been an accelerant for us to be able to move in that direction because schools have been forced to reconsider other ways of assessing people other than just test scores and numbers and SATs, stuff like that. So the economy is going to be more skill based because credentials are increasingly irrelevant, and there are lots of people that can say that they have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, right? Doesn't mean that they're good in their field. Doesn't mean that their education actually had the value that it was promised to have, unfortunately. Now, one of the things that I've talked about repeatedly is universal basic income. I think that as artificial intelligence encroaches, it will become essential that we have a universal basic income among other solutions, because otherwise society will become so destabilized that the people who are less intelligent, the people who are less capable, the people who are basically in unfortunate circumstances due to no fault of their own are going to be thrown into a situation where they have no income and no means of an income uh, rather rapidly. And what I mean by that is, I think I've talked about how there's human intelligence and there's artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence thinks differently than humans do. I've talked about how humans have a narrative way of thinking, where artificial intelligence, you just feed it massive amounts of data and it will create correlations that no human mind, even the most intelligent, would ever make. And it's often more reliable than human judgment. But there are still going to be realms where human judgment is needed, right? So artificial intelligence is going to encroach on tasks, right? And what is a job? We're so used to some of these things that we've grown up with and which are essential to the way that we view the world, but what is a job but a bundle of tasks? There's going to be this great unbundling, I think, of jobs back into tasks, and tasks are going to be matched with skills, and that's going to be largely how the gig economy functions. And what happens with artificial intelligence is it encroaches on tasks that are highly repeatable. So any job, which is a bundle of tasks, will have an automation encroachment of some subset of the tasks that are in that bundle. So maybe one job has 30% of it taken away by automation, another has 60%. Some jobs might be 100% automatable if it's a low cognitive ability job, highly repeatable. Then you start to see why human intelligence plays a great role in society increasingly as careers become more intellectually and cognitively complex. And any job that is physically repeatable or mentally repeatable, because typically blue collar jobs are more physical and white collar jobs are more mental. And a lot of people in the white collar professions are saying, oh, automation and artificial intelligence, that's a blue collar problem. No, it's also going to be a white collar problem. Doesn't matter if the repeatable task is physical or mental, both can be encroached upon by artificial intelligence. Eventually, artificial intelligence will encroach on other tasks too, more complex tasks. But right now, the areas that are going to be most difficult for AI to encroach on are going to be caring-based tasks, tasks requiring emotional intelligence, and often the caring professions. So you think about the underpaid professions right now that often a lot of women work in, there's going to be an increasing demand for that. Not to mention on top of that, you have the baby boom population, this massive population of older people, which are all going to be hitting the age of requiring care simultaneously. So maybe make a move towards that if you can. But it's really important to recognize that this encroachment by artificial intelligence on these different tasks is going to force us to reconsider our own skill sets and how we can build a career out of bits and pieces here and there, more unreliable income, more variable income, and sort of living down to a lower standard, not having the same material consumption habits of previous generations, the whole materialism and advertising culture. There's another institution that is going to get hit hard. The consumption habits of the younger generations are going to shift more towards access. So, Airbnb, Uber, maybe you don't need to actually own a car or own a vacation home. You can just access it through these apps. And also digital consumption is going to skyrocket, right? So you think about content consumption in the podcasts and the YouTube videos and the Netflix shows, everything, right? Those are all going to be increasingly highly consumed. So the last institution that I was talking about that needed serious change, the military-industrial complex. So there's this book, America's War Machine, that really goes over in depth a lot of it in an understandable way, and it actually presents solutions at the end, which is the most important, I think, personally, part of presenting any problem. You don't just want to present a problem. You just want to dump a problem on the table and say, all right, everybody, this thing doesn't work. That's it. You want to present it with some type of solution, because then you don't make it everybody's problem without an idea to spin around or other ideas to spin off of. With the military-industrial complex, the issue is that we have a vested interest, essentially, in war and a repeated state of conflict, continual state of conflict, I should say. And our military contractors, they actually spread out their subcontractors in as many different districts as possible, so that it will be the different projects like the tanks and the aircraft and whatever military weapons are as appealing to congressmen as possible, because it will bring the bacon, the pork back to their own district. It will basically bring jobs to as many different districts as possible, right? So that's one way that the military-industrial complex today has hold. The other interesting way is through think tanks, which effectively exists, a lot of them, to justify going to war. And then another interesting thing is that there's this revolving door where former generals are able to work for the Pentagon and go on air on CNN or whatever as pundits, and to effectively be the spokesperson for some Pentagon policy. Well, at the same time, double dipping and working for private military contractors where they can advertise some, they get paid to basically lobby on behalf of or represent that company, whether it's, Boeing or Lockheed or Raytheon or whoever. And on top of that, there is a clandestine, what do you want to call it? A predator drone program operated by the CIA. There's an official military one, and then there's a private CIA drone program where they can basically go into other nations and assassinate people. Think about if other countries could come into the United States and assassinate people at random. I don't think we would like that very much, right? So there's a lot of different things that are operating simultaneously and beyond the public knowledge, which we need to know more about. We need to not have an incentive to go to war. War is supposed to be a last-ditch defensive action, really. And just because it's justified in the Constitution doesn't mean it's justified in the capacity that we have right now. And once again, like other institutions that exist for a long time, they become self-justifying. So the people who have been career military basically will insist that the tools, the weapon systems, the aircraft carriers, everything are essential, and that we're going to need a new generation of them if they happen to have spent their career knowing about those technologies, right? And we keep investing, unfortunately, in Cold War weapon systems, and this is a habit that we tend to fall into a lot, where we act like we're fighting the previous war, when in reality the threat changes over time. And we're going to require traditional weapon systems less and less. We're probably going to require more and more of an investment into hackers, encoders, and special forces, and satellite protection systems and such. So the era of traditional warfare, I don't want to say it's over, but it's shifted into a more digital realm where our vulnerabilities in our computer systems will be exploited and hacked and things like that. So we have vested interests that try to keep the defense spending as massive as it is, and invested in the same things that we have been spending money on for a long time. And even the even people who have worked in the system have tried to reduce the contracts in size and say, well, we don't need 70 subs, we only need 4 of them, or things like that. And there's a pushback of, hey, if we don't get this budget, if we don't demand this many subs, then we're not going to get jobs in all these districts, and we might not get reelected. And also on top of that, we might get a reduced budget next year. We see all these kinds of incentive structures which are entirely messed up. So this is another thing that we need to dive deeply into. All of our institutions need to be reconsidered and updated, and we shouldn't just assume that just because an institution exists and functions in a certain way that is the most effective way. Some institutions are going to need to change entirely to be updated. Others are going to need to be eliminated, and sometimes there will be new institutions necessary. It's possible that some institutions can be replaced by networks, and that we don't need a formal physical institution anymore. Some of the institutions can be automated away, but these are really important, and really important changes. And I think that this is the time that we need to be talking about it, because whatever happens in 2020, we need to have deeper conversations. When I say in 2020 with elections, we need to start having deeper conversations right now, because cyclically there comes times where you can get a lot done in a society, and it's generally after crises. And we're in the midst of a crisis, right? Of a crisis right now. A bunch of interconnected crises, actually, whether we realize it or not. And it's profoundly confusing for us. And we're looking for answers, and we're looking for fixes. And we need to start talking seriously and thoughtfully and thinking harder about what those fixes might include. And then it will shape the decades to come. It will really not only shape the United States, it will shape the world. We need to start cooperating in a larger way, because the decisions that we are making affect more than just a few people or a country in isolation. We're an interconnected world, whether we like it or not. And I highly recommend reading the book, The Fourth Turning. I talked about it in the previous episode. But each of the generations will play a unique role in dealing with this crisis, in getting through the next stage, which is the high. And when I say the high, what I mean is a period of civic unity and can-do attitude, where we try to conquer new frontiers and fix the issues that have accumulated since the last crisis, which was the Great Depression and World War II. And the book talks about how crises shape society, how we come together through crises, and all the pettiness and bullshit tends to dissipate, and we start to have serious conversations and talk about what can actually be done. And we're headed in that direction, whether we realize it or not right now. And it's not just about the leader. Leaders are really important, but it's also the networks of minds and the networks of ideas. Because right now, this is one of my criticisms of social movements right now, is that they are, well, it's a benefit and an issue, is that they're decentralized and they are able to occur relatively spontaneously through social networking, right? So because they're decentralized, they're leaderless often. And that means that you can have different franchises of a movement, and they all operate in a different manner, and it can be effectively chaotic and not really leading to a particular solution or conclusion. Now, what I'm hoping is that leaders and thinkers and scholars and people who engage in this loose network of challenging ideas and coming up with ideas for the future which help humanity in as many ways as possible. I think that these people need to get together with the influencers who are capable of mobilizing mass numbers of people, because right now you have influencers who are really good at mobilizing, but not really mobilizing towards any particular direction. But if we can mobilize people and move towards a more thoughtful direction, then it's the best of both worlds. And you can fix all these institutional crises, these failures, these breakdowns that we're dealing with in the near future. This is something to look forward to. When everything seems like it's falling apart, oftentimes it's the burning away of the dead wood and the chaos that has accumulated since the previous crisis. Since World War II, think about all the institutions that have been built, and they've gone through their full life cycle. and we need to decide what to do with them. So that's pretty much all that I have tonight. I don't think that I can wring much more out of this topic, but I'm trying to bring all of these ideas together. And I don't know if you remember this, but Andrew Yang was the candidate that I had liked earlier this election cycle. He was the one that I thought really exemplified deeper thought in all these areas, as well as innovation in regard to the reforms that he recommended, unique ideas, implementation of technological solutions, and effectively the capacity to move humanity forward and to forgive people who have transgressed or failed in some capacity or who have been less than perfect, right? Because we all are less than perfect. So he was the guy that I just thought was phenomenal, and unlike the other boring or dated candidates, he wasn't endorsing a jobs for everyone program, which goes directly against technological change and effectively forces a massive bureaucracy into the system and creates more bullshit jobs. He wasn't saying it was the Mexicans' fault. He wasn't saying it was just the rich people's fault and that we need to roll out the guillotines. He wasn't putting the onus on any one group. He wasn't creating simple villains with a face that we can deport or chase out of the country or get rid of in any capacity. He was the only one with a complex narrative, with a faceless villain, which was a process, the process of technological innovation and automation and its side effects and its disparate impact on different communities throughout the United States, and how it affects rural communities, and how it contributes to the opioid crisis, and how manufacturing has left these different towns, and how it's going to continue to effectively, if we do nothing, rip the country apart and make us more vulnerable to demagogues and more vulnerable to revolutions and more vulnerable to societal collapse effectively. He was the only candidate that had the balls to talk about all this stuff. And I seriously commend him for that. And I will be working to try to continue to make people aware of the things that he talked about so that he can be the one in 2024 to take the mantle and to lead when it comes to pushing for a lot of the changes that I've talked about over the last, I don't know, hour and a half, 2 hours. Now, one of the things that I should have mentioned before, I know I said I was at the end, but a couple of things are coming to me. So when I was talking about the fourth turning and how different generations play a part, the younger generations are going to be the energy and the basically the foot soldiers in this battle. I'm hoping this battle ends up only being a philosophical and institutional battle. I'm hoping that there's no actual wars that happen in the next couple years or decade, but the younger generations tend to be the energy and the ones who fight, or the ones who take on the physical roles in the organizing, I guess I should say. And the older generations tend to be the ones that that lead or use their wisdom to maintain things on the home front and to keep order in the meantime, as the younger people, in our grandparents' case, storm Normandy. But I'm hoping we're not storming anywhere. I'm hoping that we're basically just doing what we do best, which is implementing sophisticated technological fixes to the problems that have accumulated over the decades, which previously didn't have the option for these fixes. We'll be able to use our natural domain of technological abilities to tackle these projects, which other generations lack the knowledge about, or the technological sophistication to address in these manners. But we'll be able to create solutions and work with the different generations to come up with options that address things that affect us all. You know, college debt might be a young person thing, but retirement debt is, and lack of retirement planning is an older person thing. And all of these things affect society across the board. And we need to start thinking that way, is that, you know, we're not isolated demographics. We're all part of a bigger thing. So that's all I've got. Check out Andrew Yang, start watching some of his content and listening to his podcast. And I'm really looking forward to his presidency in 2024 and continuing to talk about the ideas that he has brought up. So with that, I'm out. Have a good night, everybody.